Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Camera Carnage. I'm Ryan from Seymoure Carnage Photography, and I am here with an update to my Adobe versus DxO Pure Raw 2 video from a couple weeks ago. You can click the link above to watch that video, but basically I showed you how dramatic the differences were when you pre-processed your RAWs with DxO Pure Raw 2 versus letting Adobe Lightroom process them. Well, I had a number of questions online about how DxO Pure Raw 2 stacked up against other competitors like Capture One, which are known for handling X-Trans RAWs better. So, this week I am going to do a comparison between Capture One and the brand new DxO Pure Raw 3. Which features even more improvements for FujiFilm RAWs. So I'm not going to be getting into the details and the nitty-gritty about Capture One's user interface and things like that. We're strictly going to be looking at the processing of the RAW files. For this video, I'm using Capture One Express version 23 for Fujifilm. I'm just importing the exact same RAWs that I did for the previous video into Capture One and letting it handle them at default settings. Color handling was set to perceptual/standard. Lens detection and automatic corrections were on, with chromatic aberration, diffraction, correction, and distortion hiding all checked. Camera profile was set to auto. Clarity, sharpening, noise reduction, and defringing were all left to their defaults. There were no other edits done to these shots aside from one example, which I will call out later in the video. On the other side, I'm using the newly released DxO Pure Raw 3, which has received improvements over Pure Raw 2 for better clarity, color, lens corrections, etc. I'm not going to go into an in-depth comparison between Pure Raw 2 and 3, although I will be calling out some differences that I notice throughout the video. As before, I just imported the same RAWs that I used in the last video, checked the defaults, and exported to DNG. For consistency with the last video, I didn't even use the new Deep Prime DX option. I just used the Deep Prime. Vignetting, chromatic aberration, lens softness, and lens distortion corrections were all turned on and left at their defaults. No other edits were made. Full disclosure, I was absolutely going to purchase Pure Raw 3 out of my own pocket, but I reached out to DxO after my last video and they were generous enough to give me a free upgrade from 2 to 3 so I could do this review video. While I appreciate their generosity, I'm not going to let it get in the way of me giving you a fair and unbiased review. So let's jump into these image comparisons. I'm going to be going through each pair of images and try to be focusing on the same things that I did in the last video, just to keep things kind of fair and consistent. If you look on the left-hand side, I've got the basic RAWs as Capture One is importing and handling them with its default settings. If you look over on the right-hand side, you'll see that it's applying some sharpening and noise reduction to it. If I click on the DxO Deep Prime pre-processed images, I have turned off all the sharpening and noise reduction and any other adjustments. You can see that they're coming up as shot. The only thing that's going on is it's still using the FujiFilm X-T30 generic profile set to auto. I can't take that profile off. But just so you know that Capture One isn't adding any sharpening or adjustments on top of what Pure Raw already did, now you know. So let's jump right in here. We're going to be looking at all of these images between 100 and 200% crop. And the first thing is this letter on the side of the bookcase. And if you look here, there's just a lot less noise. All of this handwriting is a lot more crisp. Got more details in the wood and less noise. That's at 100%. This round goes to Pure Raw 3. So if we look at this photo, and remember Lightroom did a terrible job with this. There was all kinds of warming and artifacts in her face. Capture One is doing a great job. The details look pretty good, but if you look over here, everything is just sharper and crisper. The contrast is better. The edges are sharper. And if you look up at the details in the hat, everything is certainly sharper. Pure Raw 3 is doing a better job in this image as well. Jumping over to these flower carts, Come here again, look at how much crisper and sharper things are on the DxO side. It really pulls the deep colors out of the gradients in these flowers. If we pull this up, look at how much more detail there is in the wood, in the patterns here in these leaves. Everything on the Capture One side is a whole lot softer. The edges are softer. The color gradients just aren't quite there. If we jump up here, same thing. Everything's kind of soft and hazy on this side. It's harder to make out this text at 100%. Over here, it just got deeper greens. Everything's sharper on the pumpkin and these flowers. This text is crisper. PureRaw 3, I think, definitely doing a better job in handling the sharpening and detail on this image. Look also, if we zoom in on this glitter skull, same thing, everything over here is just kind of muddy and munched together. These flowers are soft. Here you've got these nice smooth gradients, and you've really got the detail in that crusty glitter. So moving to this Mickey Mouse, this was another one where we saw weird worming and artifacts in Lightroom handling this. This is looking really nice in Capture One. Everything's nice and smooth, yet it's not over smooth. You still see the details in the texture in this pumpkin skin here. All the colors are looking pretty good, but again, over here on the DxO PureRaw 3 side, the contrast is just sharper. Everything's a little sharper around the eyes. Again, this is at 200%. Once we pull out to fit, or even at 100% crop, everything is looking nice and smooth. All right, moving to this night shot, jump into 200%. Same thing, everything is just sharper and crisper, especially in these areas of high contrast. If you look up here in the leaves, there's just less noise on the PureRaw 3 side and a little more detail. Capture One did a pretty good job with this one, I think, with the colors, and the noise is better than in Lightroom, but DxO is still coming out ahead. Moving on to these shots of the Queen Mary. This was another one in Lightroom where there was just no comparison. And if you look here, again, this is looking better, but if we zoom into 200, these rivets, everything just looks cleaner and just pops more on this side. You just get a lot more detail. You can make out all of the individual little elements. Okay, moving on to this placard in the park. If we pull it over here, see again just how much clearer all this texture is in the cast metal where the paint has worn away. You can see the grit and grain of the sand and these dirt clods and everything over here. On the Capture One side, everything is just looking softer and smoother, just doesn't quite have the same contrast and level of detail. So I've been looking forward to this one in particular, just because, again, this was one where the difference in Lightroom was just extremely dramatic, and I'm really pleased with what I'm seeing here on the Capture One side. It looks like it really got the colors right. When Lightroom opened the same RAW, all of these colors were just way off. These turquoises were dull. A lot of these magentas looked more like these purples. Everything was kind of crushed down to this kind of same shade of off violet. A lot of the detail was lost in the tile work. Over here, Capture One doing a much better job with color handling than Adobe did, but PureRaw 3, again, doing a better job of replicating these colors, really getting in and seeing some of the details along the sides of these tiles. The colors actually look really close. Kudos to Capture One on this. This one was another one where Lightroom struggled really badly. Looking here, I'm really pleased with the job that Capture One is doing. It's managing to maintain this detail on the canvas and some of the detail in this picture frame that Lightroom just couldn't deal with. All that texture was just completely gone. It was a flat, muddy mess. Still sharper over on the Pure Raw side, definitely less noise here in the bricks. Again, color accuracy looking pretty good between the two, but Pure Raw pulling a little more of the reds out of here than Capture One is. And if we jump up, Capture One doing a better job than Lightroom. You're seeing a lot of this texture in the clothing. You can still see some of the texture in this hand-carved like filigree up here, but not nearly as clean and as sharp and noise-free as Deep Prime 3 is. Moving into the flag room, this is going to be another interesting one. Already impressed when we opened this in Lightroom. Greens in this palm tree were brown. Capture One has managed to maintain the colors a lot better here. Everything's still a little bit richer. The green's a little bit greener, and a lot of this stitch work in the areas of contrast are just sharper. I wouldn't be disappointed with the Capture One image, but Pure Raw just managed to pull things out a little bit better. Heading into the pool room. And when we zoom into this doorway, Capture One looking pretty good. None of the weird worming artifacts and weird rendering in here that we saw in Lightroom. You can see some of the detail in the tiles. The colors are looking pretty good. Again, Pure Raw 3 just looking cleaner, looking sharper, bringing out the colors a little more nicely. So checking out our graffiti artist here, I feel like Pure Raw may have underexposed this one. Or it could just be that, because this is not being processed at all, Capture One is just bringing up the exposure on this side a little bit. Let's have a look-see. Nope. No, exposure 0 all the way around. So I feel like Capture One in this overcast image is actually doing a little bit better job with the lighting. Let's jump in on the skin here. And if we look again, Capture One, there's none of that weird worming, those weird sharpening artifacts anywhere in his skin or in his mask. The hair's actually looking pretty good. I'm liking what I'm seeing in the high contrast areas of the shirt. Interestingly enough, it almost feels like things got a little over sharpened on this side. The hair's looking a little bit artificial, and when we look at the text on the back of his shirt, and I remember in Pure Raw 2, everything was nice and uniform like we were seeing over on just the plain Raw side. Over here, it's put these like highlighted outlines around the text that weren't there before. Pure Raw 3 kind of missed the mark on this one. I think little bits of sharpness aside, I've got to give it to Capture One on this image. Moving on to our little hummingbird on a pool umbrella here. Again, I think that Capture One is kind of handling the exposure a little bit better on this. I'm pleased to see that the greens in the head plumage are coming out nicely. There's some detail in the feathers. Again, Adobe with this same image, all these greens were lost. Everything was just like a dull brown, and a lot of this detail in the feathers and in the top of the pool umbrella were lost. I think, yeah, looking at it, especially in this area here, actually Pure Raw 3 is looking a little bit muddy, a little bit underexposed. The colors are still good, but the contrast in the feathers is, I don't know. Again, I think Capture One won this one. It was a nice sunny day. I think there's a little too much contrast, a little too much darkness, and a little too much saturation push on the Pure Raw 3 side. So kudos Capture One. Last but not least, we've got another hummingbird shot here. We're going to jump in. Let's just go up to 200%. And yeah, I think the things are looking really good on the Capture One side. Everything looking a little softer, but again, we've got good colors. We didn't lose all those greens to browns and grays. We've got nice subtle gradients in the wings there. We've got decent detail in the feathers on the Pure Raw 3 side. But, again, I think the exposure is a little low and the saturation has maybe been pushed a little bit high, and we've lost a little bit of sharpness. So it's really interesting to see the difference in consistency as we go through all these images. While Pure Raw 3 might typically be sharper in most situations, Capture One has done a really good job. Is relatively neck and neck with the color matching, and in some situations is doing a better job with figuring out the exposure and some of the saturation. So there's not necessarily a clear winner between the two of them. It kind of goes on a case-by-case basis. But now I want to go back to this flower cart. I mentioned in the setup that there was one image that I had made edits to and that I was going to call that out during the comparisons. And so here we are. But over here on the Capture One side, this is a before image. I went into the adjustments over here just to see if I could bring these two images closer together. So I made some edits over here. I pulled this curve down. I ended up pushing the structure way up in the clarity panel over here. And then in the refined settings, I pushed luminance and detail all the way up to their max, pushed color up to 73%, and I pushed sharpening up into the high 360s. So now, if we compare the two with adjustments, things are looking a whole lot closer. We're seeing a lot more detail and actually a lot more pop in the glitter and the skull here, the edges on the flowers, and some of the gradation is a lot closer. In fact, things are probably looking sharper on the Capture One side. Maybe we pull down sharpening just a little bit. So there we go. Things are definitely looking a lot closer between the two, but I had to take the time to go in and make adjustments rather than just clicking and let Pure Raw 3 do the processing. And if you look around the edges and everything here, you still see a little more noise, a little more pixelization. Pure Raw 3 is smoother yet still sharper. And I could probably go through and tweak and tune and make further adjustments to see if I could get these identical. But again, we're talking about the effort involved here, especially if you have to do this frame by frame. And just looking at how high we had to push some of these settings, we're really kind of maxing out the editing capabilities of Capture One just to try to get neck and neck with Pure Raw. And I think there's something to be said there. That's very impressive what Pure Raw is doing behind the scenes and how easily it's doing it. Alright, so let's take a minute to address some of the questions that I got in the last video. The first question was about performance, or which one is faster in handling large batches of files. And fortunately, this is not a question that can be answered directly because the two programs handle file processing in completely different fashions. Also, it's going to depend on whether or not your computer has a supported graphics card that will allow you to turn on hardware acceleration. Pure Raw opens your files pretty much instantly, but export time is going to depend heavily on what type of processing you choose to apply to the files. My computer has a high-end supported graphics card, and I found that depending on my settings, it took Pure Raw 3 about 15 to 50 seconds per file to process and export. Capture One also basically opens your files instantly, but from there it's going to depend on how much time you spend in the program doing your manual processing and then your export. So there's really not a way to compare the two. One is automated, the other one is going to depend on your workflow. The other common question was about file sizes, which makes sense because with DxO you're pre-processing your files and converting them to a different format before you re-import them to make your edits in your software of choice. This unfortunately is another question that can't be answered directly, and there's a weird reason for this. People using Pure Raw 3 are probably going to be exporting their files to DNG to open up in Lightroom or whatever their program is for processing. Capture One has this weird thing where if you export a file in DNG, it doesn't save any changes that you've made to it. So basically all you've done, even if you've edited the file, is taken the RAW and changed the file format. If you try to open it up in Photoshop, none of the changes that you made will show up, and neither will your metadata. The only way around this is to quote-unquote package the file in a Capture One proprietary format called EIP, which bundles your metadata and your change history along with that DNG file. But that doesn't do you any good unless you're again opening in Capture One. The best I could do was export files from each program to TIFF format. My original unedited RAWs were 26 megapixels and averaged about 56 megabytes per file. The exported files to TIFF from both programs averaged about 148 megabytes per file, so about 3 times the size. So if you clicked ahead in the video on this point to just find out which one is better, I've got bad news. There are wins and losses in each camp, and I recommend that you actually just take the few minutes to go back and look at the comparisons so you can see for yourself. The quick and dirty answer is that Capture One definitely does a better job than Lightroom in handling Fuji X-Trans RAWs. It consistently gave us more accurate colors and avoided any of those weird sharpening artifacts that we saw in Lightroom. However, in almost every situation, DxO Pure Raw 3 delivered better images than Capture One. Even at default settings, color and contrast were better, noise was virtually eliminated, and sharpness and detail were on another level. A lot of this has to come down to DxO's absolutely uncompromised library of lens data and possibly a little bit of black magic. Now, as I hinted before, this wasn't a complete runaway for Pure Raw 3. There were definitely certain situations where Capture One came out ahead in the comparisons. Remember though, I only used the deep prime processing in Pure Raw 3. If I had used one of the other settings, high quality or DX, things might have turned out a little bit differently. Conversely, I also showed that by going into Capture One and making some adjustments, albeit some extreme ones, I was able to get the images to come neck and neck with the DxO Pure Raw 3 output files. And that sums up the big difference between these two programs. It's investment and convenience versus effort and flexibility. Pure Raw 3 basically automates your raw processing as either a standalone program or a plugin that you can use in Lightroom. It only takes a couple of clicks and the output is very consistent and typically without fault. Sure, you still may have some other basic adjustments to make, but at this point Pure Raw has taken the heavy lifting of doing sharpening and color corrections off of your shoulders and delivered you a clean, gorgeous image to work with. Capture One still gives you a better foundation than Lightroom, and it's a full-featured editing program, which means that you can adjust as much or as little in your images as you want. But it puts the time and effort of that work on you. In the end, depending on your number of photos and the particulars, neither program is necessarily going to save you more time or effort than the other. It's just going to depend. So what's the bottom line? Well, Capture One Express for Fuji is free, and it knows how to handle X-Trans RAWs. If you don't need the full editing features of Capture One Pro or Lightroom or any other program, and you're willing to put in the work to pull out the fine details and features in your photos, then it's pretty hard to argue with free. If you're invested in Lightroom or another editor and you just want amazing processing on your X-Trans RAWs that rarely misses the mark, and you're willing to invest a little bit of money to get it, DxO Pure Raw 3 is absolutely worth the investment. If you don't believe me, download the 30-day trial and see for yourself. Thanks for watching this installment of Camera Carnage. I'm Ryan from Seymoure Carnage Photography. If you have questions or comments, please go ahead and leave them below. And be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see my future videos on similar content. Until then, take care.